Hey everyone, it's Jamie Batcher, instructor for AMP2. We're finishing up, or I'm not going to lie, we're probably not going to finish up with this lecture. We'll probably be more. But we're continuing with cardiovascular physiology. We were talking about how blood flow is regulated, and we were specifically talking about this relationship between pressure and resistance, and we're going to continue with that and apply it to the concept of blood flow. Switching to screen share mode here, and there we go. I am going to make this bigger. I just like it bigger. Wrong slide. So we go through all of these slides. There's no way for me to start it like in the middle, which is kind of annoying, but it's also a good little review of all the awesomeness that we've already talked about in this very long, very complex chapter. 1917, we're in 1919. Which is right here. So blood flow is directly proportional to blood pressure, and therefore if there's an increased blood pressure, then there's an increased blood flow. That makes sense, right? The more oomph behind it, the faster it's going to flow, the faster it's going to be pushed. However, blood flow is inversely proportional to peripheral resistance. All of those things like vessel length and vessel diameter, turbulence, etc. Increased resistance is going to decrease flow. So blood flow is determined by pressure and resistance. More important than the absolute pressure is what we call the pressure gradient. Remember that concept where everything flows from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure? Well, the greater the difference, the greater the flow, the faster that flow is going to occur. So the difference in pressure from one end of the vessel to the other end of the vessel is what we call pressure gradient. In other words, we want the pressure in the aorta to be very high versus the pressure towards the arterioles to be considerably lower, so that there can be a fast flow through the arteries and that blood can get to the capillaries to exchange nutrients and waste products with the interstitial fluid. The largest gradient from the base of the aorta to the proximal capillary beds is kind of ideal. So that's where you want the largest gradient to occur. When there are changes in pressure, there's going to be a change in flow. So if the pressure in the aorta is lower for whatever reason, or if the pressure in the arterioles is increased for whatever reason, there is going to be an effect on the flow of blood through the blood vessels. The pressure gradient can also be altered by the cardiovascular center of the medulla oblongata. Changes in rates of that capillary bed flow. We can adjust the cardiac output, the peripheral resistance by changing the vessel diameter. All of those things are going to affect blood flow. So by dilating the vessels, we're going to increase the blood flow. By constricting the vessels, we're going to decrease the blood flow. So coffee, just always drinking coffee. Changes in diameter. So as I mentioned, when the blood's flowing through the aorta is nice and has a very large diameter compared to the diameter of their capillaries. So as those vessels diverge and branch, you have an overall decrease in diameter, which is going to increase resistance, which is going to cause decreased pressure, which is going to cause decreased flow. You follow me? So the smaller the vessels, the slower the flow. So that's going to allow for this kind of exchange to take place at the capillaries. We want the pressure of the capillaries to be we want the pressure in the capillaries to be low and the flow to be slow so that this exchange can take place, right? So from the capillaries back to the vena cava, back up to the heart through the venous system, the blood vessels are converging into larger vessels. This is increasing the diameter. This is decreasing the resistance. This is increasing the flow, which makes sense because there's no pump pushing this blood from the capillaries back up to the vena cava. We want them to flow as quickly and as easily as possible. So that's kind of one of the strategies there in that anatomic makeup, I guess. Changes in blood pressure is highest at the aorta, and the heart's generating around 120 millimeters of mercury of pressure, and then the pressure drops as the arteries are branching from that. So the smaller, more numerous vessels are producing more resistance, which is reducing the pressure because it's reducing the flow. Decreased flow, decreased pressure, right? At the start of the peripheral capillaries, the pressure is 35 millimeters of mercury. So we're going from 120 to 35. At the venules, it's even lower at 18. which is why those vessels are then getting larger and larger to increase the flow, because there's not a whole lot of pressure pushing that blood through those venules and veins. Therefore, because we have the highest pressure at the aorta, we have the highest flow at the aorta, because that's where our largest diameter is. It's important to understand the relationship between diameter and resistance and pressure. So in other words, if we increase the diameter, we're decreasing the resistance. So we're increasing the flow, right? Flow, diameter, resistance, and pressure. You need to understand the relationship between all of those. So play around with, I'll stop screen sharing right now. What I suggest doing is take, if you have a whiteboard, that's awesome. If not, just a sheet of paper. Write the 4 words on a column. All my papers here have writing on them. Here's one that does. So, the 4 words: pressure, resistance, flow, diameter. Those are really the 4 most important ones, right? With each one, you're going to draw arrows up or down. So in other words, if we increase the diameter, what is going to happen to the flow? What is going to happen to the resistance? What is going to happen to the pressure? If we decrease, what's going to happen to the other ones? And then see if you can work it from any other angle. If we decrease the pressure, what's going to happen to the flow, et cetera, et cetera. So make sure that you can draw a relationship between those 4 terms, whether they go up or down in different scenarios. Sorry, the UPS guy just pulled up. I heard his big truck a rumbling. So let's see. This is not the right slide. So take a look at this picture. I'm not even going to switch the full screen. It's just, you know what? It's right here. Sorry about that. Screen share. Do we see this one? Do we see this one? There we go. This is where we left off. So changes in flow from the aorta is the highest because there's the highest pressure, because it has the largest diameter. It's slowest in the capillaries because they have the smallest diameter. There's a very slow flow rate through the capillaries. Again, that makes sense. We want it to be slow through the capillaries so that that capillary exchange can take place. And then the flow is going to accelerate through the venous system because those vessels are getting larger, which means a lower resistance, which means increased flow, even though it's a relatively low pressure. So here is some kind of visuals for you. So you can see the effect of vessel diameter, very large elastic arteries, very large vena cava, capillaries very small. You can see the relationship between the vessel diameter and pressure. Pressure is highest, closest to the heart, right, closest to that arterial end. So our arteries have a very high pressure compared to the vena cava, which have a very low pressure. And then we can see the velocity of blood flow. So it's very, very fast through the aorta and through our large muscular arteries, and then it slows very slow through the capillaries, and then increases as our vessel diameter increases as we get closer to the heart. So let's talk about changes in arterial pressure that take place during ventricular systole, right? Ventricular systole is when our ventricles are contracting and they're active. This is the peak pressure. This is what we call the systolic pressure, right? When you measure your blood pressure with a sphygmometer, I can never say it, that high number is the systolic pressure. That is the actual pressure in your aorta from ventricular systole. There's a decline during ventricular diastole. The ventricles relax, blood backflows through the aorta and down into the coronary circulation. This is the minimum pressure measured during diastole. It's our diastolic pressure. Typically, we measure it as a ratio, like 120 over 90 or 100 over 70. The high number is the systolic pressure. The low number is your diastolic pressure. So your pulse pressure is the difference between the systolic and diastolic. So you just take those two numbers and subtract them. The 120 minus 90 is going to give you 30. That's your pulse pressure. The MAP, or mean arterial pressure, is adding a third of the pulse pressure to the diastolic pressure. So it's basically taking the average. So if we have our difference of 120 and 90 being 30, and then we take 90 plus 30, and then we divide that by 3, we're getting 100 millimeters of mercury. So it's the average of it's basically the average pressure throughout our body. So the big idea is we're adding a third of that pulse pressure. I think I said that wrong. 120 minus 90 is 30. 30 divided by 3 is 10. So 90 plus 10 gives you 100. Sorry if I confused you. Here is a graphic for those terms. So you can see at the top of this graph, that kind of up and down, that is our systolic and diastolic pressures changing with every heartbeat. And notice that heartbeat is only detected on the artery side of our vessels. Once we get to the capillaries, that difference in pressure is no longer noted. It's kind of muffled out by the very small diameter and decreased pressure and decreased flow right in the capillaries and large veins. So we take that mean arterial pressure, which is where we are basically averaging the difference between our systolic and diastolic pressures. We also have capillary exchange that's going to be affected by flow. So capillary exchange is a combination of diffusion and osmosis as well as filtration. So there's lots of different forces playing a role here. Capillary hydrostatic pressure, or CHP, is the blood pressure within the capillary beds. This is the driving force for filtration. This is pushing water out of the blood and into the interstitial fluid. So capillary hydrostatic pressure is pushing out. The larger molecules, like our plasma proteins, those stay in the blood. They do not go through the capillaries. That's on purpose because most of those plasma proteins are there for a reason, to help transport or help with osmotic pressure and that type of a thing. So CHP is pushing out, pushing the water out of the blood into the interstitial fluid. Here you see on the top diagram, you can see the blood vessel and all of those solutes in it, and the CHP is pushing the water out into the interstitial fluid. Some small solutes can move, but for the most part, it's the water that's balancing, hence hydrostatic pressure. It's the pressure of water pushing out of the capillaries. You can pause the video here. You know what? I think I'm going to stop the video here. I have to run and pick up my daughter from preschool, but I will continue on with this chapter in the next little video clip. See ya.